Today we begin a whole new series on earth as it is in heaven. And what we're exploring in these next 7 weeks is our connection to all of creation. Not just the earth, but the whole galaxies and everything else that we learned about in our last series on evolving faith, evolving universe, and how we are connected to all of that, as well as the Creator who brought it all into being, right? So the theme of this is about how we are connected to everything, and that humanity is part of creation, but it's only one part of creation. That there's a lot more to creation than just us. Did you know that? In the Phoenix Affirmation, affirmation number 3, which is kind of the basis of this series, we're looking at celebrating the God whose spirit pervades, whose glory is reflected in all of God's creation, including the earth and its ecosystems, the sacred and the secular, the Christian and the non-Christian, the human and the non-human. So all of that is wrapped up into what we think of when we think of creation. Now, John Shelby Spong, who is a retired Episcopal bishop who will be with us this next weekend, as you've heard already, has written this book called Eternal Life. And when we talk about eternal life, we're talking about time that's outside of time. Eternity means all time, past, present, and future. Everlasting life is what we always think about life after death, right? That's everlasting life. But eternal life is life that knows no time. The past, the present, and the future are all wrapped up into one thing. And so this eternal presence of God being with us is what we're talking about in this sense of the light of God in creation. Now, Spong starts his book out by saying that there have been billions of years of creation that was in existence far before anything even close to the human form came on board, right? And there's most likely going to be billions of years after human form has its time on earth. So to think that creation is for the purpose of humanity only, or to think that humanity is the purpose or point of creation, Spong says, is an arrogant concept. Not only for us as humans to think that we're better or bigger than anything else in creation, or that everything in creation was promoting us, but rather also because as humans, we never get to live fully into who we were created to be if we don't realize we're part of a whole. If we think that we're the point alone, then we've missed out on what God created us to be and what we could be, and what the fullness of life and creation is all about. So Spong warns us about that. And he says that part of the environmental crisis that we are in today comes from that limited worldview. The worldview that says that humanity is the point of creation. And if that's true, if all of creation, the earth, the ecosystems, the universes and the galaxies that we don't even know about are all about the promotion of us, then it doesn't really matter how we use the resources in the world, right? It wouldn't matter how we abuse the resources in our earth. If this is supposed to be a temporal place for us to live, then why does it matter? We can use up our resources however we choose, right? We as humans get to decide that for some reason. But is this really what creation is all about? Is this really what the will of God is all about? And if it's not, then what are our alternatives to that? What are some other ways of thinking about creation or reality or humanity or divinity or all those other things that are wrapped up into that discussion that help us to see rather that we're not the point of things, but rather we're part of a whole network of relationships that are interconnected with one another, that are meshed together and held together by God and the light of God. J. Philip Newell is the man who wrote our companion book to the series. It's called The Book of Creation, and it's on sale in the back for any of you who are in small groups or would just like some daily devotional stuff. This is a great book that takes the Genesis 1 text, which we've covered a lot in By This Way of Life, but we look at it as a day-by-day creation. So this week, for instance, we're dealing with the creation of day 1, right? And then each day is going to be a week in our series, and we're going to not only be looking at how we're connected to the whole rest of creation besides us, but also how are we connected to the source of that creation, the source of the light of God, which is our first day of creation. So how do we connect with that? How do we start to uncover and reveal who God is in the light of the world? So we're going to take a look at our scriptures and other resources throughout these next 7 weeks to help us get a different perspective on creation and where we fit into the whole thing. So let's begin our journey with Genesis 1, verses 1 through 5.
The story begins this way. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. And then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness God called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day.
So God says, "Let there be light," and there was light, and creation began. And I need to turn on my mic. You're supposed to hear me, right? So with creation beginning, we've got this light of God that's now in the world. And this is no ordinary light. This is creative light. This is one big burst of creation that sets everything else in motion. Do you remember the Big Bang that we talked about in our last series? Remember how at the very beginning of the Big Bang, scientifically, they're all saying it comes from one speck of light that just explodes into being, right? This is that kind of creative light that we're talking about. That individual speck of light that has everything in it that becomes everything that is. And as it explodes, it starts to unfold and unravel and evolve into all that it's capable of being. But that one little speck has all that it needs, has everything contained within it. And it explodes. This creative light of God is a lot different than the light that's created on day 4 that we'll get to in a couple weeks. That's the stars and the moons and the suns. This is a creative light. A light that, because it is the basis of all that is, carries that life of God within each thing created. This is a continual presence of the light of God within us, within trees, within the ground we walk on, within the air we breathe, within the rain that falls upon us. God's light of this light is present with us always as part of our created being in the world. Now, this same light is the light that then connects us with everything else that's in the world, right? All of creation is connected by this light of God. This is not just to show light upon our path so we know where to go, but in a way it kind of does the same thing because it dwells within us and it connects us to everything else that's there. And this yearning that we have inside of us from this light calls out to the yearning in others, in other creation, not just other humans, but all of creation. Yearning to be connected, collected into that mainstream of life and light. Now, Celtic spirituality talks about this understanding of this light of God, the light that dwells within all of us and connects all of us together in a way that is inseparable, inescapable, not only to each other, but to God. And there is a man his name is John Scotus Eriugena. I got it right. Eriugena, who was a 9th century Celtic teacher who talks about the fact that this light is a light that does connect us all, but it's not the light, Celtic spirituality doesn't say that all things are God, but rather are things of God. So when we talk about the light of God dwelling in each of us and in all things, we're not talking about how each thing created is itself a God and ought to be worshipped. That's pantheism from the Greek philosophy. And that's not what we're talking about here. This is not that each thing is God, but rather each thing is of God and therefore has value, has meaning, has purpose, and is connected to all the rest of things, right? Another false assumption of this understanding of the dwelling of God in us is that scientifically, when we look at every day and in every way things are getting better and better, that someday we will understand most fully everything there is to know about God. If we study science and the patterns and the functions of life and the universe, that eventually we'll have it all figured out in our head and we'll know everything there is to know about creation and therefore about God. But that's not what's happening here. The dwelling within us is something that connects us and pulls us back together again, but is not the totality of God. God is not a culmination of all this light that's in creation. There's always going to be a part of God that stands outside of that. The light of God comes from God and cannot contain God within it. It's part of it, but not the full part of God. Eriugena says that there is this dark divine, this side of God that's always going to be unknowable. That is the source from which the light comes, that we know nothing about. That's the mystery of God. That's the Creator God. But the light of God that dwells in each of us connects us to that source. So it's not that God is, or that all things are God, or that we'll ever fully understand God, but that this light of God within each of us helps to reveal who God is in creation and how we are related to that. Now, another implication of this idea that if God is dwelling with us at all times and in all places in an act of creation, then why is it that we feel so separate from God? If it's true that God is with us, then we can never, ever fully be separated from God. If the light of God dwells within us, there is nothing that can separate us from that light, right? It's inescapable. And yet we feel separate. We feel distanced from God. And if it's true that God dwells in us and nothing can separate us, then logically it must be us who are separated from God. So when we stop and look at the world and the creation that we are part of in this creative act of God, then we maybe need to change some of our questions. Luther's idea of this was Deus absconditus, which is one of my all-time favorite phrases because it talks about God being hidden, God absconding, right? And it's not that God's absconding, it's just that we have so much illusion and construction and denial that we are interconnected to everything, including a creator, that we don't always hear God's voice. We don't always see the light of God in each other. We don't always recognize the love of God in a hug from a mom when you're feeling down. We sometimes deny that connectedness. And with all the different pilings up that we do, it's no wonder that we're separated from God and feel distance from each other as well as to the source of the light. So we need to start asking different questions. What is it that separates us from God? Not where did God go, but what separates us from God's light? And that's what this series is all about. How can we go about unveiling some of the things that are within us already about God? How can we reveal who God is by looking at the earth in a different way? This man here is Joe Sittler. He was one of my favorite mentors. He was a professor at the University of Chicago when I was there doing seminary. And he wrote a book called The Essays of Nature and Grace. And in that book, he says, the change in the spirit of our minds must come about by putting the grace of God behind the eyes with which we look at the world and into the hands with which we touch the world. So if what we're looking for is a way to reveal God in the earth around us and be able to recognize that and be empowered by that and connect with the light that's already there, then what we need to be doing is looking at the world in a way that speaks of God's grace, to get our hands in the dirt of the earth, so to speak, to live out a life that's connected, and in doing so, as we reach out to each other, as we greet each other and claim each other as fellow creatures in all of creation, that the revelation of God that exists in that relationship will start to burn within us, will start to emanate out of us and into the world around us. That's what this whole series on 401 Earth is about. Now, Iri Eugenia says that there are always going to be times when we feel separate from God. He calls this the divine dark. He says that we are fugitives from the true light. That much of the time we feel like we are separate from God, and that we pile so much on us that we don't always see God's light. But learning to live in this way of seeing with God's grace behind our eyes helps us to re-engage and reconnect with the earth in a new way, that in the revelation of God, in the midst of that, we might find new pathways, new ways of being in the world. And this restoration into the light of God, this restoration into relationship with each other, the Christian community calls redemption. And that's what this Easter season is all about. This is about the redemption of God, the reconciling of all of us with the source of all that is, with the relationships that we have with not only one another, but with all of creation. So when we're talking about redemption for Christians, that most fully is revealed through the person of Jesus Christ, right? We just went through the ministry, the life, the death and resurrection of Jesus. And in this redemptive act of Jesus, we are reconciled in the light of God. We are brought together. Jesus, being a person of humanity, of history and time, is someone that can then reveal God to us in history, in time, in our human understanding of things, which then redirects how we think, right? Because of this redemptive act of God, we are able to repent, to change our whole way of thinking and our whole way of seeing the world. And this then changes the way we engage the world. So this redemptive act of Jesus is represented in Paul through the letter to the Colossians. He says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, all things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might have come to have first place in everything. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross." This redemptive act of God through Jesus is the same action as creation. To be redeemed in Jesus is to be recreated, to look at life in a new way and re-engage in the relationships that we have with all of creation and the source of the light that holds it all together. Jesus in the Gospel of John is referred to as the light of the world. Our New Testament and our Old Testament testimonies come together here. Genesis, Jesus. All of us working to reveal who God is in our world, in our lives, and in our being in the world. Now, my husband has now taken up gardening. It's part of his For One Earth project to kind of re-engage with the earth and be environmentally friendly. And so he's reading all these books on organic gardening and you know, what to plant and how to plant them and what fertilizers to use and all that kind of stuff. And because he's reading all those things, I, of course, get to know all those things as well, because that's the point of our conversation anymore, right? Yesterday, I was out watching him mix some stuff together in the garden, and he was telling me about how amazing it is that you really don't have to add anything to the earth if you want to do organic gardening. To enrich the earth, all you have to do is clear some stuff away. Get rid of the debris and the weeds, dig it all up and mix it all around and get the juices flowing in it, and everything that you need to grow a plant is already in the soil. It's already there. What you need to do is care for the soil. Bring it to its richest point. Uncover it, so to speak. And get it going and ready to receive the plant that you plant within it. And then afterwards, of course, you need to nurture that. You need to water it, keep the weeds away from it, keep the earth nutritious, right? Keep it going. And then blooms appear. Whether they're vegetables, whether they're herbs, whether they're flowers, whatever you plant already has everything inside of it to grow within the earth. And the earth has everything inside of it to already grow it to its fullest potential. It's kind of an apt analogy, don't you think? The light of God has everything we need to become the people we were most fully created to be. The best humanity in creation that there is. But that doesn't mean we stand alone. It means we stand in relationship with all that is. And creation, as it's nurtured, blooms most fully in the abundance that God created, in the abundance that God intended. So how are we caring for that earth to allow plants to grow? How are we caring and nurturing our lives with one another, our thoughts of one another, our engagement with the world? This For One Earth mission is specifically designed to help us think about that, to be very attentive to how we engage with the world. And we have 50 days of Easter. The season of Easter lasts 50 days, by the way. Easter is not over. It's not, the season of Easter doesn't technically end until you hit Pentecost, which is May 19th. So we have 50 days to talk about the earth and to set 3 goals with the United Church of Christ. Their 3 goals are to do 1 million hours of earth care. Think you can do that? How many of you can find an extra hour in a day? Oh, well, good for you. Yay. That's great. We have now 5 hours. We need 1 million. But this is a national campaign, and it's not just the hour that you spend a day out in your garden. Scott's going to count those hours that he works in his garden, but he also gets to count the reading time that he puts into organic. He also gets the time that we sit and discuss how we're connected to all of that and how cool that is. 1 million hours of earth care is something that all of us are engaged in. It's really not that much to ask. And I think we're well on our way to actually doing that. Another goal that they have is to plant 100,000 trees. This encapsulates the Earth Day, the 50 days, Earth Day, Arbor Day, and Pentecost, as well as Easter. So planting 100,000 trees is in partnership with the Arbor Foundation here in Nebraska. And give trees away. Plant trees. Plant anything. And we'll be toward our goal. 100,000 letters of environmental advocacy to write to political advocates, to write to your newsletter, do op-eds for your newsletters, your newspapers, anybody. Do a gardening class for somebody and tell them about what they can do to talk about the issues of environmental care within your community. That's all part of it. And the United Church of Christ right here at Countryside has its own goal that we've been given an $18,000 grant in order to do some amazing stuff at the church that will help us rethink how we do energy. It's not pretty stuff. It's not stuff you can put a bow on and say, here, help. But it's things like air conditioning and all the stuff that goes into making this building happen. We need to rethink how we do that. And think of it in terms of being green. And we need some funds to help us rethink that stuff. So we're hoping that there will, since we have this matching grant, that we will get donations that match this $18,000 that will help us green this building up. Not only the landscape outside, but within, the stuff that's not so pretty, that you don't always see, like the furnaces and the electric lights and the energy reuse and all that other kind of stuff. So that's the fourth goal that we technically have here at Countryside. Plus, there's going to be a ton of different opportunities to participate in the community through community gardens like City Sprout. We have the Living Waters Association, which is part of the United Church of Christ, has a bunch of events planned. And we have a full committee here at Countryside that's working on connecting us to larger community events that are happening, as well as things we can do individually at home. So be sure and be looking at those bulletin announcements and newsletter announcements to see how you might engage. Because in acting as if you care for the world, you might actually start caring for the world. You might be able to see these analogies. I don't dig in the dirt. I don't do gardens. But now I know a lot about gardens. And I might actually enjoy something that comes out of a garden now. And that's all news for me. So I'm already starting to look at life in a little bit different way just because my husband has had that experience. So your experience with that light of God becomes other people's experience with that light of God. And we nurture each other in the same way. Now, J. Philip Newell, who wrote this book on creation, has a wonderful quote here that I'd like to share with you. He says, God is to be found not by stepping aside from the flow of daily life into religious moments and environments, or by looking away from creation to some kind of spiritual realm beyond, but rather by entering attentively to the depths of the present moment. There we will find God, wherever we may be and whatever we may be doing. Our times of religious observation and meditative practice are not alternatives to encountering God in the ever-flowing stream of life. Rather, they are moments of preparing ourselves to be alert to the one who is always and everywhere present, closer to us than we are to ourselves. That's an amazing quote, that by living and being in the world, we are connected to the source of creation in the world. And then worshiping together, we celebrate that light of God that connects all of us in that creation. And we are connected to that redemptive act that's about collecting all that light together. This is the redemptive act of God through Jesus Christ, who in the night in which he was betrayed took bread and broke it, gave thanks and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body given for you. Do this for the remembrance of me."